The convoy had already stopped once at the security gate, and the guard on duty had waved it through without hesitation. 3 black vehicles, no plates visible from the street, moving in practiced formation across the hospital's restricted east entrance, the kind of arrival that told every staff member within eyeline to straighten up and say nothing unnecessary. The morning was grey. Sunderland Regional Medical Centre rose above the car park in pale concrete layers, its upper floors still catching the last of the pre-dawn dark. By 6:20 a.m., the loading bays were already busy, supply lorries reversing into position, porters trading shifts near the staff entrance, a security officer drinking something hot from a paper cup he held with both hands. The convoy pulled up beside the private consultation wing. Callum Dredd stepped out of the second vehicle before the driver had properly stopped. He was not what most people expected. 58 years old, lean without being sharp, dressed in a dark wool overcoat that had seen better winters. He wore no watch anyone could see. He carried nothing. His personal security detail moved around him with the quiet efficiency of people who had been doing this for years, scanning rooftops and parked vehicles, and the faces of staff members, the way a doctor reads a chart, quickly, completely, moving on. The hospital's executive director, Lawrence Halcott, was already waiting at the consultation wing entrance, hand extended, expression arranged into the particular smile reserved for major donors. Dredd's foundation had funded the wing's cardiac imaging suite 2 years earlier, and the new dialysis unit currently under construction in the North Building carried his name on the planning documents, if not the door. The meeting this morning was to conclude the final terms of that project. Paperwork, signatures, the kind of business that required exactly 1 hour and then everyone could return to their day. Dredd shook Halcott's hand and followed him inside. He was gone for 43 minutes. When he emerged, something had changed in his face. Not dramatically, not visibly, to anyone who didn't know how to look, but Petra Voss, standing 12 feet from the entrance, noticed it immediately. She had worked for Callum Dredd for 9 years. She had seen him negotiate with government ministers. She had watched him sit across from men who had tried, on 2 documented occasions, to have him killed. She had never once seen him pause before walking to the car. He paused, now. He stood on the front step of the consultation wing and looked slowly back toward the main hospital building. His eyes moved across the car park, the laundry service entrance on the far side, the staff corridor windows on the ground floor. Petra was beside him in 4 steps. Everything all right? Dredd didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, the laundry worker. The woman assigned to the restricted supply corridor this morning. Petra waited. Where is she? Petra reached for her radio. She didn't ask why. 9 years had taught her that his questions were never random. Inside the main building, Halcott was already reviewing the day's schedule, satisfied that the morning had gone smoothly. He had no idea that in the next 20 minutes, his hospital was about to become the center of something he had no framework to understand. And somewhere, on the number 47 bus, heading away from Sunderland Regional, a woman named Vera Okafor sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring out a window and wondering if 15 years had amounted to nothing at all. She had arrived at 6:15, same as every Tuesday for the past decade and a half. The staff entrance on the hospital's east side opened with a code that had been changed once in 5 years, and Vera punched it in without looking down at the keypad. The locker room smelled of disinfectant and the faint sweetness of someone's fabric softener, the same smell every morning, anchoring and familiar. She changed into her uniform, laced her shoes, and tucked her small tartan thermos into the top of her locker. Black tea, no milk, brewed before Marcus left for school. She never drank it during the shift. She didn't know when she had stopped doing that, only that the habit of bringing it had continued, because the ritual of making it each morning was less about the tea and more about the 10 minutes of quiet in her own kitchen before the day began. By 6:30, she was pushing her cart through the B corridor toward the restricted supply wing. Vera Okafor was not a small woman, and she moved through the hospital with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew every corner of a building by feel. She had started at Sunderland Regional at 26, hired on a short-term laundry contract that had simply never ended. In the years since, she had raised Marcus mostly alone, survived a winter when the heating in her building failed for 3 weeks, and never once called in sick on a day the ward was short-staffed. The nurses on the 4th floor knew her name. The overnight security team always left a biscuit on her cart if they'd had extras. One of the senior consultants, a vascular surgeon named Dr. Park, had a standing habit of nodding to Vera on his way to theatre in a way that conveyed more genuine respect than most of the morning briefings his juniors received. She was invisible to most people, and she had long since made her peace with that. The corridors in the restricted wing were quieter than the main wards. Supply trolleys lined the walls. The air smelled of clean linen and rubber wheels, and the particular cold that came from temperature-controlled pharmaceutical storage rooms. Vera worked steadily, collecting used linen from the bin stations outside each bay, sorting the loads with an efficiency born from pure repetition. At the junction between the restricted corridor and the service lift vestibule, she slowed. An elderly woman in a hospital gown was standing near the wall, one hand braced against the painted plaster, looking down at the floor with an expression of quiet distress. She was perhaps 80, small and fine-boned, her white hair held back with a clip that had come half loose. At her feet, scattered across the polished floor, were the glass beads of a broken rosary. One had rolled under the edge of Vera's cart. Vera stopped the cart without a word. She crouched down, her knees protesting slightly, and began gathering the beads one at a time, placing them carefully in her palm. The elderly woman watched her. "I was just going to the chapel," the woman said. Her voice was thin with embarrassment. Vera retrieved the bead from under the cart. She straightened, opened the small sealed bag she kept on the cart for found items, and set the beads inside, folding the top of the bag closed. "I'll keep them safe for you." She handed the bag to the woman. "Ask a nurse to help you fix the string when you get back to your room." The woman took the bag with both hands. She didn't say thank you immediately. She just held the bag and looked at Vera with the expression of someone who had been surprised by an ordinary kindness at a moment when the world felt unkind. Then she nodded once, deeply, and shuffled back toward the ward. Vera watched her go, then returned to sorting linen. She had done the same job for 15 years, and in those 15 years, she had returned lost phones and medication cards, and once an entire sealed envelope of cash that a distressed family member had left behind on a waiting room chair. She had never told anyone. There was no reason to. She pushed the cart around the corner toward the pharmaceutical corridor, and the morning continued exactly as mornings did, until it didn't. Raymond Spence walked the way men walk when they believe their presence alone should be enough to correct a situation. Shoulders forward, chin slightly raised, shoes clicking hard against the floor. He was 52 years old and had been a laundry services supervisor at Sunderland Regional for 11 of those years, a fact he referenced with a regularity that suggested no subsequent achievement had superseded it. He found Vera at 817A, outside the restricted corridor's linen bay. There was a damp patch on the floor near the fire door, a small one, roughly the size of a dinner plate, left by a leaking supply trolley that a porter had already reported to maintenance an hour earlier. Spence crouched beside it, pressing 2 fingers to the floor as though conducting a diagnosis. He looked up at Vera. He didn't lower his voice. "This area was on your schedule this morning." Vera set down her folded sheets. "I finished this section at 7. The trolley leak was reported after I left." "I'm not interested in the trolley." He stood. "I'm interested in what it looks like when the cardiac team brings their donors through here in 20 minutes and there's a damp floor with no cone and no sign." Vera reached for the wet floor sign on the side of her cart. Spence stepped in front of it. The action was small. It was enough. There were 3 people in the corridor. A porter loading supplies at the far end who had suddenly become absorbed in his clipboard. a nursing assistant who had slowed her pace near the corner, pretending to check her phone. "You've been in this department for 15 years, Spence said, "and you still can't anticipate what this floor needs before it becomes a problem." He let that sit for a moment. Then he looked her over in the way that wasn't about the floor at all. "And frankly, this is a premium consultation wing. The people walking through here are major contributors to this hospital. The kind of impression we make starts with who they see the moment they enter." Nobody moved in the corridor. Vera kept her face still. She had learned that stillness years ago, not because it was natural to her, but because it was the only response that denied him what he wanted. She said nothing. He held out his hand. "Your badge, please." She looked at him. "There have been ongoing concerns about performance and presentation in this wing. I'm taking you off the morning rotation, pending a review." Her hand moved to the laminated card clipped at her collar. She had worn it through 3 hospital rebrands, 2 strikes, and the long, terrible months when the wards were overwhelmed and staff had worked shifts that blurred into each other without sleep. She unpinned it slowly. She placed it in his palm. She collected her thermos from her locker. She folded her gloves. She walked to the staff exit without looking back, and the door closed behind her with the same quiet sound it made every morning, the same as if she had simply finished a shift and gone home. The porter at the end of the corridor watched the door for a moment after she left. Then he went back to his clipboard. The nursing assistant put her phone away and continued down the hall. Spence straightened his jacket. The corridor resumed its ordinary noise. Only the elderly woman in the chapel, turning a sealed bag of glass beads over in her careful hands, would have said that anything important had just left the building. Petra Voss had a gift for reading institutional confusion. She could tell the difference between people who didn't know something and people who didn't want to say they didn't know something, and as she moved through the hospital's administrative floor at 9:03 a.m., she was encountering large amounts of both. The request had gone out across the internal radio system 6 minutes earlier. Identify the laundry services employee assigned to the restricted corridor in the B wing between 6:30 and 9:00 a.m. The request had been framed as a routine inquiry from a visiting Foundation representative. It had produced, so far, 3 transferred calls, a department head who had gone to find a file and not returned, and an HR administrator who kept insisting that all personnel matters required 24 hours written notice. Callum Dredd stood in the main corridor outside the operations office, hands in his coat pockets. He had not moved from that spot in 11 minutes. Around him, the morning shifted and reorganized itself to accommodate his stillness. Porters diverted their route slightly. A consultant who had been walking toward him changed course without appearing to. A ward manager who emerged from a side door took one look and retreated back through it. Halcott appeared from the end of the corridor, slightly breathless. "Mr. Dredd, I've just spoken with laundry services. They're confirming which staff member was assigned to that wing this morning." Dredd looked at him without expression. "Take your time." The tone was not sarcastic. That was what unsettled Halcott most. There was no performance in it. Dredd simply meant it, with the particular patience of someone who had decided that this was where the morning would be spent, and comfort was not part of the calculation. A junior administrator appeared at a half-run, stopping awkwardly at Halcott's elbow. "We've identified the employee. Her name is Vera Okafor. Laundry services, 15 years of service. She was assigned to the B-wing restricted corridor this morning." "Good," said Petra. "Call her now." The administrator looked at the floor. There's a complication." Halcott turned. "What complication?" "She was removed from her shift this morning. Supervisor Raymond Spence issued an immediate suspension pending review. The paperwork was filed at 8:22 a.m. The corridor went quiet in the way that corridors go quiet, when the people standing in them all understand simultaneously that something has gone wrong. Dredd spoke without raising his voice. "Where is she now?" "We believe she's already left hospital grounds." Petra was already on her radio. Her other hand moved to her phone. She had made 3 calls before Halcott had processed the information well enough to respond to it. Halcott looked between them. I can assure you, whatever Raymond Spence's reasons were, Dredd turned and walked back toward the exit. Petra followed. Halcott stood alone in the corridor, the junior administrator beside him, and felt the particular discomfort of a man who had been managing an institution smoothly for years and has just discovered that something has been happening inside it that his smooth management had entirely failed to notice. On the restricted corridor below them, a wet floor sign stood uncollected beside a dry patch where a leak had been. The flat was on the 3rd floor of a converted building on Garfield Street, and it looked out over a row of terraced houses and, on clear days, a sliver of the river. The lift was unreliable. Vera had stopped trusting it 2 years ago and took the stairs without thinking about it, the way you stop thinking about all the small inconveniences that have simply become part of a place. Inside, the radiator ticked. The kitchen light had a slight delay when you switched it on, a half-second pause before the bulb committed. Marcus's trainers were lined up by the door with a precision she had not taught him and was proud of, anyway. She set her bag on the kitchen table and stood for a moment without moving. Then she filled the kettle. She didn't know why. She never drank tea at this hour. She had the thermos for that, still full, still faintly warm in her bag. She filled the kettle anyway and stood watching it. And when it boiled, she poured a mug and set it on the table and didn't touch it. The flat was too quiet in the way that places only go quiet when they're usually not. For 15 years, this time of day had belonged to the hospital. It had a smell and a temperature and a texture, clean linen and antiseptic, and the cold of the pharmaceutical corridor, the weight of the cart handle, the particular echo of her shoes on sealed concrete. Now there was a kitchen. A mug going cold, the distant sound of traffic. Her phone was on the table. It buzzed, once at 9:40, unknown number. She turned it face down. At 9:52, it buzzed again. Then again. She moved it to the counter. She sat down in Marcus's chair by the window, the one with the slightly broken back she kept meaning to fix, and looked at the rooftops. Raymond Spence's voice played back in her head with the involuntary clarity that humiliation produces the way it lodges, cleanly, resistant to reason. Premium consultation wing. The kind of impression we make starts with who they see. She had known men like Spence her entire working life. She had outlasted 3 of them. She had believed she would outlast this one, too. The mug on the table had gone cold. She was not crying. She had trained herself, a long time ago, to feel the shape of something like this clearly, to not soften it and not collapse into it, to let it sit precisely as it was until she understood it. What she was understanding now was that the thing that hurt was not the humiliation itself. She had survived worse. What hurt was the arithmetic. 15 years of careful attendance against a single morning of bad faith, and the badge had gone all the same. Her phone lit up again. She looked at it from across the room. The number that appeared was Marcus's school. She crossed the room and answered it. But it wasn't the school. It was Marcus himself, calling from a borrowed phone because his was dead, asking if she could look in his drawer for his swimming kit. He needed it Thursday. Not today. He was just checking. His voice was quick and ordinary, and full of the irrelevant urgency that teenagers apply to everything. And she said yes, she'd check. She was home. It was fine. He paused. "Why are you home?" She almost said something efficient and closed the conversation. Instead, she said, "I had a difficult morning," he said, more gently than she expected. "What happened?" She told him the short version. The corridor, the patch of damp floor, the badge. There was a pause on his end. Then Marcus said, almost offhandedly, "Was that the corridor near the cold storage? Because I remember you told me once that was the weird one, the one that always smelled different." Vera went still. She hadn't thought about the corridor in those terms. She had been thinking about Spence, about the badge, about the long bus ride home. She had not been thinking about what she had actually seen that morning before any of that happened. The cold storage vestibule. The service lift junction. 2 men. A silver pharmaceutical case with a hairline crack across the latch. She sat down slowly on Marcus's chair. Petra Voss ran searches the way other people breathed, steadily, without drama, with the understanding that the information was there, and the only question was how quickly you reached it. Within 20 minutes of leaving the hospital, she had Vera Okafor's address from payroll records, her registered mobile number, her emergency contact, a sister in Leeds, and a map of the bus routes that ran from the hospital's east entrance to the Garfield Street area. She had also done something else. She had pulled the hospital's internal incident report for the B-Wing restricted corridor, filed at 8:22 a.m. under Raymond Spence's supervisor code. She read it in the back of the moving car and said nothing for a moment. Then she passed it to the investigator beside her. He read it. His expression changed. The report described Vera's dismissal using 3 phrases: poor attention to hygiene standards in a premium zone, inadequate performance pace, and presentation inconsistent with the consultation wing environment. There was nothing in it about what Vera had been doing in the corridor. There was nothing about the service lift vestibule. There was nothing about the 2 men Petra now had reason to believe had been there. Because nobody had looked, she said, half to herself. Her phone buzzed. One of her analysts, back at the hotel they'd taken as a temporary base. There's a second vehicle. Petra. Registered to a logistics company that dissolved 6 months ago. It's been parked near the hospital's east entrance since 7:40 a.m. It didn't follow the convoy in. It followed it to the hospital and stopped outside. Petra sat forward. Where is it now? Relocating. As of 8 minutes ago, it was heading toward the residential postcode we pulled for the Okafor address. She gave the driver a look. He accelerated. They were still 12 minutes from Garfield Street. Vera, meanwhile, was staring at the kitchen wall, the cold mug untouched in front of her, trying to rebuild a memory she hadn't known she needed to keep. She had been at the service lift vestibule at approximately 7:55, collecting from the last linen bay before Spence had found her. She had been working. She had not been watching the corridor. That was exactly the point she had been doing her job, which meant she was invisible, which meant the 2 men who passed through that junction had not adjusted their behavior for her presence. The first man had come through the security door from the pharmaceutical cold storage side. He wore a hospital maintenance jacket, the blue ones that facilities management wore, and he was pulling a silver hard-sided pharmaceutical case on wheels. It was the standard kind, the ones that ran between cold storage and the dispensary. She had seen hundreds of them. She had nearly backed her cart into this one. She had said sorry. Neither man had looked at her. The second man had been waiting near the lift. He had an identical case. They had exchanged them not in the way of people who had coordinated this exchange in advance, but in the way of people who had done it so many times that the coordination was no longer necessary. No eye contact. No words. 20 seconds. Perhaps less. Then, they walked in opposite directions. Vera had turned back to the linen bay. She had thought nothing of it, because in a hospital, equipment was always being moved, routed, handed off between departments. There was no reason to question it. Except, she closed her eyes. The case that the first man had been pulling, she had been close enough to it to have to step aside. Close enough that she had seen the latch. And the latch had a crack in it, a fine hairline fracture running across the upper right corner, and the crack had a small dark stain at one end that she had assumed was dried pharmaceutical residue. She opened her eyes. She would not have remembered that if Marcus had not said the word corridor. She was reaching for her phone when someone knocked on her door. She didn't answer immediately. The knock came again 3 times, measured, not aggressive but not patient. Through the door, she said, "Who is it?" A woman's voice, calm and direct. "My name is Petra Voss. I'm head of security for Callum Dredd. We spoke with your hospital this morning. I need to speak with you, Miss Okafor. You're not in any trouble, but I need you to open the door." Vera stood in the kitchen. She didn't know the name Callum Dredd. She thought of the unknown numbers on her phone. She thought of the morning, which had already been the worst morning in recent memory, and felt a hot wave of resistance. Then she thought of the 2 men in the corridor, and she opened the door. Petra Voss was compact and unhurried, with close-cropped gray hair and the eyes of someone who was always solving a problem 3 steps ahead of the visible one. Beside her stood a younger man, and behind them both, at the end of the landing, a third. Petra didn't step inside before being invited. She said, "I need to ask you about this morning, specifically about what you saw in the restricted corridor near the service lift vestibule." Vera looked at her for a moment. Then she stood aside. They sat in the kitchen. Petra declined the tea Vera offered, but the offer had been instinctive, and Vera went through the motions of making it anyway, filling the kettle again, because having something to do with her hands made the thinking cleaner. "Tell me what you saw," Petra said. "Don't filter it. Don't decide what's important and what isn't," Vera told her. "The maintenance jacket, the 2 cases, the exchange. No eye contact, no words. The latch with the hairline crack and the dark stain." Petra sat very still through all of it. When Vera finished, Petra glanced at the young man. He was already typing on his phone, feeding something into a database. His expression shifted. "What's the stain?" Vera asked. Petra looked at her. "We're not certain yet. But the crack, can you describe the shape?" Vera traced it in the air with one finger, the way she had traced it in her mind all morning without knowing she was doing so. Horizontal, starting from the right side of the latch. Then it angles down, like an incomplete Z. The young man looked up from his phone. His face had gone careful in the way of people who are trained not to show surprise and are failing slightly. From the stairwell below came the sound of the outer door opening. Footsteps on the stairs. More than one person. Petra was on her feet before Vera had processed the sound, moving to the doorway, hand at her side. The young man behind her shifted his position. The footsteps stopped. Petra spoke quietly down the stairwell. "This landing is secured. I suggest you take the exit you came through." A pause. Then the footsteps descended. The outer door opened and closed. Vera stood in her own kitchen, kettle beginning to rumble, and understood for the first time that the morning she had assumed was simply the worst of her working life was something considerably larger than that. Petra turned back to her. "We need to go. Now." She paused, and something in her manner softened by the smallest possible degree. "You're safe with us. Do you want to call your son first?" Vera looked at the phone on the table. She picked it up and dialed Marcus's borrowed number. When he answered, she said only, "I'm all right. There's something I need to do. I'll explain tonight." He said okay in the way that meant he had understood the tone, if not the content. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the cold mug on the table. She did not pick up her thermos. The restricted consultation wing looked different when you entered it through a service corridor with a private security escort. The same polished walls, the same temperature-controlled air, the same faint hum of the hospital's infrastructure, but the staff members who passed them moved differently now, with the particular alertness of people who had been told that something was happening without being told what. Halcott met them outside the conference room. His expression had moved through confusion and arrived somewhere closer to dread. The room held 6 people when Vera entered. Petra, the young analyst, a woman from Dredd's legal team who had driven up from Leeds that morning, Halcott, and a man Vera didn't recognize, who was introduced only as a federal pharmaceutical investigator named Ashby. He was younger than she expected, in a dark blazer, and he looked at Vera with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for her specifically. Callum Dredd was standing by the window. He turned when she came in. He was taller than she'd expected, and quieter. The room's noise organized itself around his silence in a way she hadn't experienced before. He waited until she had sat down before he spoke. "Thank you for coming back." Vera looked around the table. She felt the unreality of it. The same hospital she had been cleaning since her late 20s, the same institutional air, but a room full of people treating her account of a Tuesday morning as though it were the most important thing in the building. "I'm not sure I understand why I'm here," she said. Dredd folded his hands on the table. "We believe you were the only person working in that corridor this morning who had no reason to adjust what they remembered." Vera looked at him. He continued, simply, "Security staff know which cameras are running and which aren't. Supervisors know which routes will be observed. The men in that corridor knew exactly what was being recorded and where the gaps were. But they didn't adjust for you. She said nothing. Because they didn't see you, Petra said. Not really. The large screen at the end of the room came to life. A series of photographs appeared. Pharmaceutical case manifests from customs logs, flagged by Ashby's division over the previous 8 months. Cold chain transport cases, all hard-sided, all silver. 4 different incidents. 4 different registered couriers. Ashby spoke. These cases all entered the customs review process with correct documentation. All carried legitimate pharmaceuticals. All were released. We flagged them because the pharmaceutical contents didn't match the cold chain temperature logs at the receiving end. The temperatures were consistent with something that had been in a different environment for part of the journey. Something had been inside those cases before the legitimate contents were placed there. What? Vera asked. We believe. Stolen biomedical research data, Ashby said. Encrypted storage media, sealed inside compartments built into the case lining. 3 institutions across Europe have reported the theft of proprietary genetic sequencing patents in the last 5 years. The method was always the same. The original data disappeared from secure internal servers, and the physical backup media could never be accounted for. No courier network we could identify. No obvious breach points. He looked at Vera. Until this morning, we had no confirmed description of a physical exchange point. Petra placed a photograph on the table. It showed a pharmaceutical case from a customs inspection 18 months earlier. The latch was visible in the corner of the image. Vera looked at it. She leaned forward. The crack, she said. Petra nodded. Vera's eyes moved across the image. It was not the same case. The scratch on this latch ran at a slightly different angle, but the damage pattern, the thin fracture line, the dark mark at the corner, the method of damage was identical. Same latch type, the analyst said. Bespoke modification. The crack isn't accidental. It's a marker. A way to identify which case carries the payload in a swap where both cases look the same from every other angle. Vera sat back. She thought of the moment beside the linen bay. The man with the maintenance jacket, not looking at her. The way he had pulled the case around her without acknowledgement. The way you navigate furniture. She had been furniture. And because she had been furniture, she had been close enough to see the thing that told the 2 cases apart from each other. Dredd spoke quietly. The ones nobody watches are the ones who remember. It was the first time she had heard those words, and she felt them land somewhere below the rational. She said, "What do you need from me?" What they needed took the better part of 2 hours, and by the end of it, Vera felt as though someone had turned her memory inside out and examined every seam. Ashby's questions were careful and patient. He did not lead her. He circled back 3 times to the same moments from different angles, and each time she found something slightly more precise: the angle of the first man's approach, the exact position of the 2 cases when they were closest together, the direction the second man had walked after the exchange. The direction mattered. The second man, the one who had been waiting, had walked away from the service lift and toward a corridor that Vera knew led to the basement supply receiving area. She had assumed he was returning to work. It was where maintenance staff went after collecting from pharmaceutical stores. But he wasn't maintenance, the analyst said. No one from facilities management was assigned to that corridor on today's rota. He had been wearing a facilities jacket, but his access was logged through a contractor pass issued 6 weeks ago to a supply chain firm called Bridgeport Medical Logistics. Halcott's face changed. Bridgeport handles our overflow pharmaceutical storage. Ashby looked at him. How long have they had that contract? Just over a year. Do you have access to their storage agreement? Specifically, which areas of the building fall under their jurisdiction? Halcott's assistant was already on the phone before he finished the question. The Bridgeport contract covered the basement supply receiving area, a temperature-controlled storage bay, and written into a subsidiary clause of the facilities agreement, a secondary storage room, adjacent to the building's old pathology corridor. The clause described it as equipment overflow. In 11 months of the contract's operation, no member of hospital staff had been required to enter it, and no inspection had been made of its contents. No one had thought to look, Petra said. Ashby was already relaying information through an encrypted channel. Within 20 minutes, federal pharmaceutical investigation officers arrived at the hospital's south entrance in unmarked vehicles. They were accompanied by 2 people from the National Cybercrime Unit, whose presence Halcott clearly did not know how to process and managed by simply standing very still. The basement corridor smelled of old concrete and cold, the particular cold of spaces that haven't seen natural light in a long time. The door to the secondary storage room was reinforced, not obviously, not with anything that would draw attention, but when the investigator's contact tool touched the frame, it registered a density inconsistent with a standard fire-rated interior door. They went through it in 4 minutes. Inside were pharmaceutical cases, 11 of them, stacked and secured. Each one looked identical to the ones in Ashby's customs photographs. Each one had a latch. 3 of them had the hairline crack. An investigator crouched beside the nearest case and opened it. The pharmaceutical contents were legitimate, sealed and labeled correctly. But the base panel lifted at one corner, not broken, but hinged. Beneath it was a sealed compartment, and inside the compartment was a flat, encrypted drive in a static-proof sleeve. The investigator held it up. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Ashby, on the phone, said to the officer on the other end, "We have physical confirmation. Activate the secondary teams." And on a floor above, in a conference room with a window that looked onto the grey morning, Vera Okafor sat with an untouched glass of water in front of her and felt the particular disorientation of someone who has done an ordinary thing and discovered it was not ordinary at all. The lockdown came in stages, which was how it had been planned, not a single loud moment of alarm that sent people running, but a quiet tightening that most of the hospital staff and patients didn't register until it was already complete. Exits sealed. The 2 main car parks were blocked by vehicles that looked like they could belong to any large organization. The loading bay deliveries were paused on a security pretext that the logistics coordinators accepted without question. Internal radio traffic on non-essential channels went silent. In the restricted corridor on the B wing, 2 federal officers found the Bridgeport contractor who had played the role of the waiting man. He was in the facility's changing room, halfway out of the blue maintenance jacket, and he stopped when he saw them, with the very specific stillness of someone whose entire strategy for the last 12 months had just collapsed into a single Tuesday morning. He said nothing. There was, by that point, very little to say. The man who had come through the pharmaceutical security door was identified 20 minutes later in the hospital's car park, sitting in a delivery van with Bridgeport Medical Logistics printed on the side. He had been waiting for a signal that was not coming. When the officers knocked on his window, he wound it down with the resigned calm of someone who had known, on some level, that the operation was already over and had been waiting to confirm it. Inside the Bridgeport storage room, the technical team worked steadily through the 11 cases. 8 of them contained concealed compartments. The drives recovered from those compartments were individually sealed and catalogued. The analysis would take weeks, but preliminary checks confirmed what the investigators had suspected. The encrypted files contained fragments of proprietary biomedical research drawn from 3 separate European research institutions, all targeted over a period of 5 years, all through the same mechanism: legitimate courier contracts, legitimate pharmaceutical transport agreements, ordinary supply chains carrying extraordinary cargo in spaces that nobody in the hospital supply management chain had thought to examine because the paperwork was always correct. In the conference room, Vera watched through the glass wall as people moved urgently through the corridor outside and felt the strangeness of being entirely still while everything around her reorganized itself. Petra sat beside her and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You understand what happened this morning?" Vera said she thought she did. Petra said, "We've been tracking this network for 14 months. 4 institutions, 3 countries, 2 false starts that put witnesses at risk before we could act." She paused. "Every time we got close to a confirmed exchange point, The surveillance failed. This network is very careful about cameras, Vera said, quietly. They weren't careful about me. No. Vera looked at her hands. The ones nobody watches are the ones who remember. She had heard it from Dredd an hour earlier, and it had settled into her like something she had always known but never been told. Petra looked at her steadily. You cleaned that corridor 5 days a week for 15 years. They saw a cleaner. They didn't see a witness. Vera nodded. She picked up the glass of water and then set it back down without drinking. Outside the glass, someone was on a phone call, gesturing, precise with urgency. A door opened somewhere and closed. The hospital continued around all of it. Patients in beds, nurses in wards, the vast quiet work of keeping people alive that ran beneath every other story the building contained. She thought of the elderly woman and the broken rosary beads. She thought of Marcus asking why she was home. She thought of 15 years of mornings and the particular sound of her shoes on sealed concrete in an empty corridor at 6:30 a.m. She thought about all the things she had noticed and never told anyone, because there had never been a reason. Most people had gone by the time Dredd came back into the conference room. Ashby was still in the building, coordinating with the federal team in the basement. Halcott was somewhere in the operations suite, working through a process he would spend the next several months working through. Petra was in the corridor on her phone, her voice low and steady. Dredd sat down across from Vera. He said, "You want to know why I stayed?" She had been going to ask it differently, more carefully, more politely. She said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone choosing their words for effect, but the silence of someone who means to say something precisely. My foundation has been cooperating with Ashby's investigation for 8 months. The network had been using hospital supply chains to move stolen research data out of the country, and the research in those cases included work from a medical technology firm that the Foundation funds, early-stage gene therapy research. The kind of work that takes decades and costs more than the people doing it will ever see returned in their lifetimes. He looked at the table. Someone had been trying to sell it. Not to one buyer, to several. The kind of fragmentation that makes reconstruction almost impossible, and prosecution nearly so, because each piece looks like an isolated incident. Vera listened. He continued. We had identified Harrison. We had identified this hospital as a likely transfer point. We had identified the Bridgeport contract as the likely mechanism. We had no confirmed witness to a physical exchange, because every time we reconstructed the timeline, the operational cameras had failed in the relevant window. He looked at her. My analyst identified you in the staff rotas. You were the only person working continuously in that corridor during the window in question. Every other presence in that area was intermittent, or recorded, or both. He paused. You were there. You were not on a camera. And you had been sent home before we could speak with you, Vera said. So you stayed. He said, meetings can be rescheduled. Research that has been fragmented and sold cannot easily be reassembled. And the one person who could confirm what happened in that corridor was on a bus going home because her supervisor decided she didn't look right for the wing. Vera looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, he was right about one thing. I didn't notice anything because I was watching. I noticed it because I wasn't. I was just doing my job. Dredd said, yes, that's exactly it. There was a pause. Somewhere in the hospital, an announcement played over the tannoy. A procedure, a reminder, something routine. The sound of the building continuing, Vera said, almost to herself. 15 years of being invisible, Dredd said quietly. It's not nothing. She considered that. Then she stood, and he stood, and she held out her hand, and he took it. And it was a simpler gesture than everything that had surrounded it. In the corridor outside, Raymond Spence was standing near the water fountain at the far end, watching the conference room through the glass. He had heard enough by now to understand the shape of what had happened. He looked at Vera when she came out, and then he looked away, and he didn't look back. Vera didn't stop. She had nothing she needed to say to him. She understood that his judgment of her had not changed who she was, and she understood that her absence of revenge was not forgiveness, it was simply refusal. She would not spend the energy. She walked to the staff locker room and took her thermos from her bag. She twisted the cap. The tea was cold. She drank it anyway, standing at the locker, because she had made it before she knew this morning was coming, and it deserved to be finished. 3 months later, in October, Vera Okafor flew to Edinburgh for a 2-day working visit to Northern General Hospital as part of a frontline staff welfare review. It was the 4th such review she had participated in since taking the role of employee experience consultant with the Dread Foundation's healthcare division, a position she had accepted, not because she had been looking for a new direction, but because the direction had simply arrived and she had recognized it. The work suited something in her that had been looking for a name. She visited wards and laundry rooms and kitchens and portering stations and talked to people who spent their working lives in the parts of hospitals that the architecture didn't prioritize. She listened. She wrote reports that were careful and specific and did not editorialize, because she had learned that specificity was more persuasive than argument. She had sat in rooms with hospital directors and explained, in plain terms, that the people who cleaned the floors and moved the linen and stocked the supply corridors were not interchangeable with the infrastructure itself, and that treating them as such had costs that didn't always appear on the balance sheet but appeared everywhere else. The Sunderland regional investigation had resulted in 7 arrests, the dissolution of the Bridgeport medical logistics contract, and a full review of supply chain oversight protocols across 5 NHS-affiliated hospitals in the north of England. The stolen research had been recovered largely intact. 3 of the 4 institutions whose proprietary data had been taken confirmed that prosecution was proceeding. Raymond Spence had resigned before the internal review reached his disciplinary file. His departure was quiet and brief and generated no press coverage. The Unseen Professionals Program, a training initiative Vera had helped design over the summer, focused on management recognition of frontline worker contributions, had been adopted by 2 hospital trusts and was in discussion with a 3rd. The name had been Marcus's suggestion. She had credited him in the program documentation, which had embarrassed him and made him proud in equal measure. In Edinburgh, on the afternoon of the 2nd day, Vera was walking through the hospital's central services corridor when she heard it. A clatter, sharp and startling, and then a silence that stretched a second too long. She turned. A young porter, perhaps 19, had dropped an entire tray of sealed specimen containers on the floor. None had broken. The containers were sealed, but they had scattered widely across the sealed concrete, and he was crouching to collect them, with the specific urgency of someone who has done something wrong in front of people who will make it worse. A charge nurse at the far end of the corridor was already walking toward him with the speed of someone who has decided what the situation is. Vera reached him first. She crouched beside him and began picking up containers, placing them back on the tray with the same unhurried precision she had brought to 15 years of folding sheets. The young man looked at her sideways, uncertain. The charge nurse arrived. He started to speak, Vera said, without looking up. "He's got it." She glanced at the nurse in a way that was not challenging, but was entirely clear. "Give him a moment." The nurse paused. Then he nodded and walked on. The young porter finished collecting the last container. He straightened, holding the tray, and looked at Vera with the expression of someone who had been braced for something and received the opposite. She said, "Take a breath. Everyone drops something." He nodded, not yet trusting his voice. She gave him a small nod and continued down the corridor. At the end of the hall, Callum Dredd stood waiting near the exit. He had come up from a meeting in the administrative wing to walk her out. He had seen the whole thing from 30 feet away. He said nothing when she reached him. He simply held the door. Outside, the October air was cold and clean, carrying the smell of rain on stone. They walked toward the car park. A plane crossed somewhere above the low cloud, its sound arriving long after it had passed. Vera took the thermos from her bag and twisted the cap and drank from it as they walked, and it was warm and real and ordinary, and she did not think about the cold mug on the kitchen table in Garfield Street, or the badge in Raymond Spencer's palm, or the men in the hospital corridor who had moved around her as though she were furniture. She thought about the young porter's face when no one had shouted. She thought about an elderly woman in a hospital gown, holding a sealed bag of glass beads with both hands, nodding once, deeply. She thought about all the things that happen in the quiet parts of buildings, the corridors, nobody photographs, the hours before the official day begins, the work done by people whose names don't appear anywhere, and she understood, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that those quiet parts were not background. They were the structure. Everything else was built on top of them. The world had a habit of celebrating the loudest voices, the most photographed arrivals, the names on the donor plaques, and the annual reports and the press releases. It had a habit of measuring importance by visibility, of equating worth with recognition, of treating silence as absence. But the ones nobody watches are the ones who remember. And sometimes the truth that changes everything is held by someone who never expected to carry it. Someone who simply arrived early, did their work carefully, and noticed what everyone else was too busy to see.